I'm indifferent.
I don't believe in God.
To the existence of
God is not judging them.
I don't have proof.
I don't know how to pray.
They're judging themselves.
You know, where is God in all of this? This is my home.
God exists.
What does it say about God that he created the orgasm?
I don't pledge allegiance to anything.
I don't pray.
Only to God.
If there was a God,
And I thought,
I just have this understanding that life is hard.
he could never love me after this.
God is still good.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Maybe God podcast. I'm your host, Eric Huffman. If you're new here, please make sure to follow Maybe God wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube right now, be sure to subscribe to this channel. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming weekly content that's always aimed at helping hopeful skeptics and doubtful believers have deeper conversations by asking some better questions. And to that end, today, I'm very excited to welcome into the Maybe God studio a fellow Houstonian, Professor Nancy Pearcey. A former agnostic, Professor Pearcey was hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Professor Pearcey is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University, and she's the best-selling author of 7 books. Today, we're going to dig into 2 of her most recent books, Love Thy Body, and her brand new book, out a little over 2 weeks now, The Toxic War on Masculinity. Both are awesome books. I read them in preparation for today's conversation, and both are available at Amazon and wherever books are sold. Professor Nancy Pearcey, welcome to Maybe God.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
It's really an honor. I've obviously, being in Houston, I hear your name all the time in various kinds of conversations and presentations that I attend, and you've been to my church, The Story, with your son a couple of times, several years ago, but we were, I was just sharing with you that a lot has changed since then at The Story, and so new digs, as you see here, a new home, a new building, and yet we still have the same mission, both at our church and also with this podcast, to speak to folks that maybe have more questions than answers. They might even be agnostic themselves, or even atheist folks that just have a lot of questions about Christianity and the assumptions Christians make. And that's what I really appreciate about you and your story and your approach to your work, is how you speak not just to the hardcore Christian base, but I think you write in such a way that is really, it's really powerful and accessible to folks that aren't entrenched in the Christian camp. So tell us a little bit about your story and sort of your journey to Christianity.
Well, yeah, it is the reason that I write the way I do, because I'm much more aware of the secular world and the need to engage with it. And the reason is I was raised in a Lutheran home. It was Scandinavian Lutheran. And okay. I don't know if you know, but Scandinavians are all Lutherans. I
didn't know that. I thought, Germans, like my folks were very often Lutherans, but I didn't know that about Scandinavians as well.
Oh, yeah. If you're Norwegian or Swedish, my mom's Norwegian, my dad's Swedish. It's like all Irish or Catholic.
Yeah.
And the weakness of that, though, is they often rely on the ethnicity to hold you. There wasn't a lot of real personal commitment in my home. And so in high school, I started asking questions. It was really one question. It was, how do we know Christianity is true?
Yeah.
I'm attending a public high school. All my textbooks are secular. All my teachers are secular. And I just started asking, well, how do we know that Christianity is true? And unfortunately, nobody in my life could answer that question. I talked to a Christian university professor and asked him point blank, why are you Christian? He said, works for me.
He was a professor. You would expect more from him.
Exactly. And then I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean. And I thought, here, I'm going to get something more substantial. But all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes.
That's it.
As if it was a psychological phase that I would outgrow.
Right.
And so I eventually decided maybe Christianity just didn't have any answers. And I very intentionally walked away from my Christian upbringing and decided it was up to me to find truth, to find out what really was true. And literally, I started walking down the hallway at the public high school I attended and pulling books off the philosophy shelf, because I thought, well, if I can't get any live people to talk to me, maybe these dead guys, maybe that's their job, isn't it? The philosopher's job is to answer questions like, is there truth? Yeah. And how can we know it? And is there a foundation for ethics, or is it just true for me, true for you? Is there any meaning to life? And I very quickly realized that if there was no God, the answer was no on all counts.
Yeah.
There is no meaning to life. We're just an accident, chemical accident, flying through space.
Did you find yourself rejecting that philosophy, or did you embrace that?
Oh, I totally embraced it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to be honest. That's how I thought of it. I thought it was a matter of intellectual honesty, that if there was no God, I really want to work out the implications of that. I wanted to be Bertrand Russell.
Yeah.
The guy who said, life is just an accidental collocation of atoms. And
Sure.
My favorite phrase from him was that modern person must build his life on the scaffolding of unyielding despair.
He sounds like a delight. Someone you want at the party.
But I didn't want to. I had friends who were losing their faith, but still hung around the church for social reasons, emotional
Yeah.
reasons, and I didn't want to do that.
Why?
I didn't think that was honest.
Ah.
If there was no God, I wanted to face the fact that there is no foundation for ethics, no meaning to life, unyielding despair. I realized there was not even a foundation for knowledge. The way I thought of it was, if all I have is my puny brain in the vast scope of time and space, what makes me think I could achieve some sort of universal, objective, absolute truth? Ridiculous. And
right.
that's how I thought of it. At age 16, ridiculous.
Sure, especially if your brain is nothing more than just evolved tissue, and a part of a greater process that is just basically a machine designed to crank out more life and propagate the species and nothing more. I mean, if that's all your brain
That's
is.
right. That's right. The ideas in your brain are there for survival value,
Right.
not for truth value.
Yeah.
And so by the time I graduated from high school, I had absorbed all of these isms, relativism, skepticism, and even determinism. From my science classes, I learned that we were just biochemical machines anyway, with no free will. So,
Yeah. So backing up a little, did you risk losing the relationships you had back home by leaving Christianity in a public way? Did you risk your relationships with mom and dad, or were those relationships you wanted to walk away from? Like, what was that like?
I didn't tell them.
Okay, really?
No, they had no idea.
Yeah.
But it was a couple of years later, I was in Europe. We had lived in Europe when I was a child. So all through high school, I saved up my money so I could go back.
Yeah.
And that's how I stumbled across the ministry of Francis Schaeffer, who is known for an apologetics ministry.
Right.
It's in Switzerland. The name
What's it called?
L'Abri.
L'Abri, that's right.
Which is
Yeah.
French for the shelter. Mm-hmm. They named their houses over there. They did. It was already called L'Abri when they moved in. But that was the first time I encountered any sort of apologetics. That was the first time I ever heard Christians make a case that you could support Christianity with logic and arguments and reasons. And they knew the isms, better than I did.
Yeah.
And I had never met any Christians who could engage with the secular isms that I had absorbed by that time.
Did they initially engage with you like with hostility, or like was it a friendly sort of thing? What was
They
it like?
loved it.
Really?
That was what was so unique about it. If I did talk to any Christians before this, it was always, "What's wrong with you? Why don't you have faith? Do you have a moral problem?"
Yeah.
That was the response I got.
Sure.
And at L'Abri, it was like, "Oh, we love questions.
Wow.
Great, let's talk."
And for someone seeking truth above all else, that must have been really refreshing.
Oh, it was very refreshing. I was stunned. I was blown away.
Yeah.
I just never encountered Christians who were like that before.
Was there a moment at L'Abri when you became a Christian for real, I guess, or was it a process?
No, it was a moment. But actually, it was not at L'Abri. I was there twice. The first time I left because
Why?
Because it was so attractive. I thought I might be drawn in emotionally, and
Wow.
I didn't want to do that. Here were Christians who were intellectually engaged, culturally engaged. Schaeffer was known also for supporting the arts.
Yeah.
And by the way, I was in Germany studying violin at the Heidelberg Conservatory.
Wow.
So, his interest in the arts was very important to me. And then on top of all this was 1971, and everyone there were hippies.
And you?
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Hair down to here.
Really?
Yeah. Granny dresses. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And the rest of it, too. And
Sure.
experimenting with drugs and such.
Yeah.
But everyone was. And that was before any Christians were really reaching out to that cultural divide, right? And reaching out to the cross culture, the counterculture, to these disaffected young people. And so that really spoke to me as well. I thought, who are these Christians that they can talk to hippies? You know?
Sure.
But Christianity had let me down once before, and so I didn't want to be drawn in emotionally. I wanted to be absolutely convinced that it was true.
Yeah.
And so I left because I felt so much inner pressure to come to some kind of decision. But it was through L'Abri that I discovered apologetics. C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton.
Sure.
You know? And so just on my own reading, I eventually did. I did reach a very decisive moment when I said, okay, you could keep learning for a lifetime, but I know enough that I am intellectually convinced that it's true. And so there was a decisive moment. And then I said, where do I find Christians?
Right.
Because I wasn't in a church or anything.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I knew some back at L'Abri, so I went back.
Yeah.
And that's when I really got grounded in Christian worldview and, the whole personal side of it, as well as the intellectual side, so that it was more well-rounded, applying to the whole person.
Sure, the whole person. That's very important to your work. It's a common theme, body and soul, and the whole of the person. I think that is a powerful story, Nancy, and one that I think will resonate with a lot of people, not least of which because of your misgivings or mistrust of emotion and emotionalism. And I think that's a hang-up for a lot of people. I think more and more people are okay with the logic of the Christian worldview. More and more evidence that comes out. I saw Stephen Meyer on the Joe Rogan podcast the other day, and I'm like, wow, it's these ideas are leaking out into the mainstream, but it's the emotional and trusting sort of Father God-ness of Christianity that is so intimate and raw that it can be really intimidating for folks sometimes who might not be real strong in regard to building emotional bonds.
Well, I deal with that in my next book.
Yeah?
The Toxic War on Masculinity.
Right.
So I'll give you a preview.
Yeah.
I start the book with my own story growing up in a very abusive home. My father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they'll sometimes say, was it open hand or closed fist?
Yeah.
It was closed fist.
Gosh.
And he would not say, do this or I'll spank you. He'd say, do this or I'll beat you. He was very open about it.
It was normal for him?
I guess. Yeah, not sure where it came from. But so part of my story of L'Abri was on staff was a psychiatric social worker. And she agreed to be part of L'Abri because she realized that for many people, their barrier to Christianity is not just intellectual. So, Schaeffer's taking care of the intellectual questions.
Right.
But for many people, it's also emotional. And especially if you've grown up in a Christian home, it's often conflict with your parents, especially pastors' kids and missionary kids.
Yeah.
So this psychiatric social worker was a missionary kid.
Wow, really?
Yeah, from New Zealand. Her name was Sheila Bird, and we called her Birdie.
Uh-huh.
And so right from the beginning of my even considering Christianity, I was talking to Birdie, and she was helping me to work through the emotional side, the emotional barriers. Because as my intellectual questions were being answered, then I had the freedom to sort of look beyond them and say, I actually don't want this to be true.
Yeah.
There is an emotional side to this. I do not want to be at all like my parents. If my parents are Christians, I don't want it. That was my perspective. Whatever they have done with their lives, I don't want it. And I had tried to, when I left home, I tried to totally wipe out my past. I said, I'm going to start over. I'm going to create a blank slate and recreate my whole self from scratch. Well, Birdie helped me realize you can't do that.
Yeah.
You actually have to work through all that trauma from your childhood. And so there was, L'Abri gave me both, therefore. It gave me the philosophical, apologetic side,
right.
But it also got me started on very deep, profound emotional healing, spiritual, psychological healing. And Birdie just showed me kind of love that I'd never experienced before. That's it. I mean, love heals.
That's right.
Love heals. And if you can get to a deep experience of God's love, that's what heals. When I left L'Abri, I would pray and kind of think of God as Birdie, because that way I could sense that kind of love, which I didn't know from anywhere else.
I think that is with the faltering numbers in terms of active and good fathers in the world. I think it is making Christianity a harder, steeper climb for people who are considering it. If you don't have an example of a loving father, how can you possibly relate to the loving father? And it takes people like Birdie, to sort of stand in the gap and show people who haven't had that what love really looks like, self-sacrificial, all-giving kind of love. And once you see that, you can't unsee it, right? And that's when I think the harder work of the emotional intimacy kind of comes into view. And for a long time, I hid behind apologetics as a way of skirting the emotional stuff. And so I'm sort of, that's what interests me about your story, is I can relate in some ways. It's just easier to read intellectual books and have intellectual conversations for me than it is to go deeper into the heart.
So in The Toxic War on Masculinity, I do have 2 chapters on domestic abuse and violence in Christian homes. So that was my chance to sort of bring it out.
Wow.
And
Birdie would be proud.
I miss her.
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk about Love Thy Body. This is a book that you said has been controversial, but not as controversial as maybe the Masculinity book, which we'll circle back to. Clearly, I mean, you tackle every hot button major issue in our culture today, but there is sort of a common thread running throughout all of these worldview, or I guess all these hot button topics, and it comes down to worldview. And you want to posit a biblical Christian traditional worldview up against this other thing. So let's talk about that other thing, and what is that other worldview that's in competition with the Christian one, and how does it affect all of these issues, from abortion to euthanasia to sexuality and gender issues?
Yeah, that is what's unique about the book, because Christians have often tried to sort of approach each of these issues separately. Schaeffer used to actually talk about this. He said we approach issues in bits and pieces.
Yeah.
And I've actually had students, a pro-life student who said, I'm memorizing all these, arguments so that when I get online, I can talk to my secular friends. And I came to realize that would take forever, because new arguments can always be raised. But if you get to the heart of it, it turns out there's a common underlying worldview that connects abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism, and so on. And it is a view of the body, actually, which is surprising, because most people think Christians have, they're otherworldly, they don't care about the body.
Yeah.
But it turns out that Christians actually have a much higher view of the body. Let's start with where it's most obvious, transgenderism. Because transgender activists argue explicitly that your authentic self has nothing to do with your body or your biological sex. A BBC documentary put it this way: at the heart of the debate is the idea that mind can be at war with your body. At war. And of course, in that war, it's the mind that wins.
Right.
There was another BBC video aimed at teenagers. It featured a young woman who identified as non-binary. And she says, it doesn't matter what meat skeleton you've been born into. It's what you feel that defines you.
Yeah.
So the body's been demoted to a meat skeleton.
Right.
The Washington Post recently, it's not in the book because it's more recent, but the Washington Post recently quoted a curriculum for first graders in which teachers were told to tell their kids, you might not be a boy, even if you have what some people call boy parts. And you might not be a girl, even if you have what some people might call, not even what are, but what some people might call girl parts. So your boy and girl parts, your body parts don't matter.
Right.
They're not really part of your authentic self. And of course, since I write a book, I have to read what the academics say. And so it was the first book, I think, that came out defending transgenderism by a Princeton University professor. And first of all, I was surprised that she acknowledged that transgenderism involves, in her words, self-alienation, self-estrangement, disconnect, And I thought, this is a defense? It sounds more like a critique. But then she says, it doesn't matter, because, and then this is her exact words. She says, what the real body, she meant the physical body, what the physical body tells us is nothing. It has no meaning at all. So that's the core of the transgender ideology. Your body has no meaning at all. It gives you no clue to your identity. It gives you no moral message. You know,
and therefore it can be shaped into whatever form you need it to be to fit your mentality or how you feel.
Exactly. You can do with it. You can do with it whatever you want. There's another quote. Camille Paglia is a fairly well-known public intellectual. And by the way, she's been a lesbian for many years, but now she's come out as trans.
Huh.
Interesting.
Yeah.
She hasn't changed her appearance at all. She still looks the same.
Right.
She's not trying to look like a man, but she's calling herself trans now in interviews. But she has a wonderful quote. It's wonderful because it really reveals the logic behind it. And she wrote it when she was still had a lesbian identity. So what she wrote was, people find her interesting because she's a little of an iconoclastic feminist. She does not think sex is just a social construction. She says, no, nature made us male and female. In fact, she
She's
says,
old school.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In fact, she says, this is a direct quote, our sexual bodies are designed for reproduction.
Wow.
Designed is an interesting word for an atheist.
Is. Yeah.
But then you say, well, in that case, how can you justify being lesbian or now trans, either one? And here's how she puts it. Nature made us male and female, but why not defy nature? After all, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit.
So it's like
yes.
a declaration of independence of sorts, like we're our own gods and goddesses.
Yes. And so the message is, if our bodies are a product of mindless, meaningless, purposeless forces, then they have no intrinsic purpose that we are morally obligated to respect. You know, they give us no moral message. They give us no clue to identity. So we may do with them as we see fit, which is just what you were saying a minute ago. So that's the logic.
How does that worldview apply to other issues, let's say, other than the trans issues, and even other than sexuality? Let's talk about, for example, euthanasia or assisted suicide and any other issues you see as relevant to this or pertinent to this conversation. How does that worldview infuse these other conversations?
Yeah, let me start with abortion, because euthanasia is just the same reasoning, but it's sometimes easier to see with abortion. Essentially, no professional bioethicist today denies that life begins at conception.
Right.
You know, ordinary people may not all know that, but professional bioethicists, the evidence from genetics and DNA is just too strong to deny it. So how do they defend abortion then? They say, well, biologically, physiologically, genetically, the fetus is human. That's clear from science. But it's not a person. So legal personhood is something different. You become a person when you reach a certain level, certain mental abilities, certain cognitive abilities.
Wow.
Self-awareness.
When does that happen? 3 or 4?
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, you just put your finger on the weakness of that theory, is nobody can decide when does it happen, how developed do these cognitive abilities have to be?
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of people will say, well, sometime before birth. But there are bioethicists today who say, no, after birth. Crick and Watson, the duo who discovered the double helix structure of DNA, have both gone on record publicly saying that we should give parents 3 days to do genetic testing on their newborn. And only if it passes those genetic tests do we call it a person.
So then you could have a post-birth abortion.
Yes.
I remember the quote, I made a note of it, the quote from your book where you quoted the Journal of Medical Ethics, where it was published, this quote, since non-persons have no moral rights to life, there are no reasons for banning after-birth abortions, which is chilling.
Exactly. So there's now something called a human non-person. So in other words, you can be human and yet not a person. So being human is no longer enough for human rights. And by the way, the most extreme position I've seen is Peter Singer, who is a bioethicist at Princeton. And right on his website, he says 3 years of age is still a gray area. in terms of personhood, which is
Yeah.
what you started to say earlier. Well, what about 3 or 4?
Yeah.
He said that, exactly. Because how much cognitive functioning does a toddler have? So for him, even that's a gray area.
Wow. That's scary stuff. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, and neither do you, but the fact that this is being seriously bandied about in, our most advanced academic circles, that's terrifying.
Yes, because what's happened is personhood now is a completely arbitrary, subjective concept. Once it's separated from being biologically human,
Yeah, there it is.
as long as it's connected to being biologically human, and this is what Christians would argue, God made us
Right.
as physical beings, and so we should take our identity from our body. We should respect our biological sex. And we start with, well, is the fetus biologically, genetically human? Yes. Well, then they're in.
Right.
Then they count.
Sure.
Whereas if it's separated from that, and that's empirically knowable. That's scientifically testable.
Yeah, you don't need religion to make that point.
Exactly.
Right.
Once you separate personhood from biology, then there is no objective criteria, and every bioethicist out there draws the line at a different place. And so it's become a matter of private views and values. And that's interesting. There's a bioethicist I think he's a psychologist actually, at Yale University, Paul Bloom. And he was quoted in the New York Times saying, the question of abortion is really not about biology. It's about that magical moment, his phrase, that magical moment at which a cluster of cells becomes more than a mere physical thing.
Wow.
It is a question about the soul. He says this right in the New York Times. So, in a sense, they're acknowledging this is their alternative religion.
Yeah. It's a lot of mysticism in that sentence.
Yeah, so who's bringing religion into the public square?
Yeah. Very interesting. And clearly this has implications for our culture, and we're seeing it playing out in a lot of different ways. But you have dedicated so much of your work in recent years to developing a theology of the body. And I know all of these issues are important to you, but what was it really that led you to want to spend a good portion of your career on sort of staking this claim to the sacredness of biology and the integrity of the body?
I can't tell you. No. Because in my family, the book has a lot of anecdotes, a lot of stories, personal stories. And many of them are pseudonyms. And that's because many of them are people who were not ready to become public with their story.
Pseudonyms.
Pseudonyms.
Got it. Yeah, I thought you said synonyms. I just heard you wrong. Yeah, got
pseudonyms. Fake names. And it's because many of them were not ready to go public yet.
Yeah.
And so these were people close to me and in my family. And so it did grow out of a very personal experience. And when people read it, sometimes they guess that because they say, you couldn't write like this if you hadn't been there. And it's true. But they're not ready to go public yet. So just know that it's coming out of a lot of personal experience. And I realized that through my own working through these issues, I realized the body is the core of it. If you, let's take homosexuality since we haven't touched on that yet.
Sure.
Even my homosexual friends agree that on the level of biology, physiology, anatomy, chromosomes, males and females are counterparts to one another. That is how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed.
Sure.
To embrace a same-sex identity, therefore, is to contradict that design. Is to say, well, why should my body inform my identity? Why should my biological sex have any say in my moral choices? And so we have to help people to realize that's a profoundly disrespectful view of the body.
Yeah.
And so when Christians talk about a biblical view, they're saying you should respect your biological sex. You should live in harmony. We don't want to live in contradiction, that inner self-alienation, that disintegration of the body from the person. A Christian ethic actually is about self-integration and inner wholeness. And so that's the way we should phrase it. Christians are so well known for having a negative message.
Right.
I was just talking to somebody who has a youth ministry in Hawaii. It was a podcast.
Sounds great.
And he was saying, until I read your book, all I had was a negative message. I would say, it's a sin, it's wrong, it's against the Bible, don't do it, it's destructive, and there's something wrong with you. Right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're known for.
Yeah.
Whereas I find that the hardest thing for people to get their mind around when they read Love Thy Body is how to change their language to say, no, the goal is to respect your body, live in harmony with your body, live in tune with the Creator's design. I'll give you one story from the book. A young woman who has lived as a lesbian for many years and today is married to a man, you have to say that, and has 2 children. And she wrote an article about it. So here's how she put it. What made her change? She said, I came to trust that God had made me female for a reason. And I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design.
Wow. That's different. You don't hear that a lot because people don't think about same-sex attraction or other sort of alternative, let's say, lifestyles. A lot of people don't like that word, in relationship to the body and our intrinsic design.
Yes, so I'll give you another story. This is maybe my favorite story. It's a young man named Sean who grew up exclusively same-sex attracted. By the way, you have to say exclusively because when you do change, people will say, well, you weren't really
Oh,
gay.
yeah, right.
You were bi all along.
Right, sure.
So he makes a point of saying, no, I was exclusively attracted to other men. And the interesting thing about his story is he grew up in a gay-affirming family and attended a gay-affirming church.
Oh, so there wasn't that kind of pressure.
He didn't think there was anything wrong with
Yeah.
that. Today he's married to a woman and has 3 children. And by the way, he's a Christian ethics professor
Whoa, really?
in London. But so he says, well, why would he change then? It was not driven by shame and guilt. Even Christians sometimes think, well, if you changed, it was just shame and guilt and self-loathing. Right. He said, no, I came to, basically, it was the first story I ever read that fit my book exactly. He said, I came to realize that God had given me a male body. And therefore, he had created me to interact sexually with a woman. And that if I respected my body, here's how he put it, I didn't try to change my feelings. That doesn't usually work.
Yeah.
What I did was I decided to take my identity from my body. And instead of changing my feelings, I accepted what I already had, which was a male body, as a good gift from God. That was his term, a good gift from God. And eventually my feelings followed suit. So again, you see how his change was driven not by anything negative, but accepting my body as a good gift from God. And that's really, when you used the word worldview earlier, that's the worldview core of all of these issues. Do we live in a cosmos, that was produced by blind material forces?
Indifference, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins, blind, pitiless indifference.
Yeah, he's another real upper for a party. Yeah.
Or do we live in a cosmos created by a loving God, which therefore we should accept as a good gift from our Creator?
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, this what you say makes so much sense when you say it, but then we all go back out into the real world, and the plot has been so lost for so long, even in the church. I mean, we don't make this case strongly enough in the church, and we haven't for a long, long time, that I think the average person listening to this will go out and have a conversation about this, what they're hearing now, with a friend at the coffee shop, and not be able to make the case for body-positive Christianity. And so I just want to be clear about what you're saying right now. You're not saying, I don't want anybody to hear you saying that you can, with the snap of a finger or a choice in your mind, just let go of all of the same-sex desires. If you're a same-sex attracted or gay person, that doesn't necessarily just go away overnight or ever, right?
It takes years. So in the book, I give the story of Rebecca. Rebecca went through about a decade of being attracted to other women. Even after it started when she was not a Christian, it continued after she became a Christian. It continued after she got married. And so she talked to her husband about it. And here's what he said. No matter what your feelings are right now, you can be confident that because God made you a female, you will ultimately be more fulfilled with a man. And of course, same for me, he said. I mean, God made me a male. So no matter what my feelings might be, I can be confident that I would ultimately be more fulfilled with a woman. That was the turning point for Rebecca. It was logical. It made sense. It took 4 more years. It took several more years for it to sort of gradually sort of fade.
Right.
So it's not overnight, and that's what we have to be aware of when we're talking to people. Even if they do change, these things are very intractable and can take a long time.
Sure. And it's so countercultural to
And
say...
and not everybody does. We should say that too.
Yeah, sure. But it's so countercultural to say, hey, maybe think about rejecting your feelings. Reject your, you're not entitled to act out on your feelings. And it's really bad for you, actually, to be governed by your own feelings of self-identity on any given day. And maybe we should pay more attention to our design or biology.
And another thing that's helpful is that non-Christians are starting to see it too. They're starting to see, you'll sometimes see the phrase, transgender ideology is body hatred. Rejecting the body, or where's this anti-biology philosophy coming from? I do include this interview in my book. There was an interview with a 14-year-old girl on a website, and she had lived as a trans boy for 3 years. She had transitioned at age 11, and then at age 14 recovered her identity as a girl. And these are her exact words. She said, "The turning point came when I came to realize it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body." And I thought, perfect. And this was a non-Christian on a very secular non-Christian website. And she saw it. Or another one was a young woman who transitioned at age 14, lived as a boy for 5 years, until age 19, and detransitioned. And she writes up her story on her blog. And she says, when I transitioned to boy, I got so much support and affirmation, and everybody celebrated and told me how authentic and how courageous I was. She said, here's how she put it, the boy me got a lot more accolades and affirmation than the girl me ever had.
Wow.
Then she detransitioned, and she lost all her friends.
Nobody came to that party.
Oh, just the opposite.
Right.
They attacked her, they accused her, They heaped all kinds of abuse on her. And so she writes, what is my advice then to a young woman? Since right now, it's mostly, transgenderism is way up with women. So what would I say to a young woman who is
Women transitioning to men? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, the rapid onset gender dysphoria. Teenage girls deciding to identify as males. Much higher numbers than males transitioning to a female identity. So she says, what would I say to a young woman who had gender dysphoria? She said, if I could convince just one girl to love her body as it is, all the abuse I've suffered will be worth it. And her blog was called Anti-Theist. So she's not even an atheist, she's an anti-theist.
Yeah.
So this is clearly a non-Christian. So even non-Christians are starting to recognize this. And there's a book, probably the most recent book that's come out, is just called Trans. It's by Helen Joyce, not a Christian. And the subtitle is something like When Ideology Hits Reality. And because she's British, she's a well-known journalist in Britain, a lot of people endorsing it are non-Christians. Richard Dawkins endorsed it.
Wow.
And all of these evolutionary biologists are suddenly coming out of the woodwork and saying, well, we're biologists, and this transgender ideology rejects biology. So Brett Weinstein?
Yeah.
Weinstein, yeah. So he's come out, he's an evolutionary biologist. Colin Wright, who wrote a book called Reality's Last Stand, evolutionary biologist.
How interesting. The strange bedfellows.
Jerry Coyne at the University of Chicago has a blog called Why Evolution is True.
Yeah.
And he spent his career attacking Christians on the science issues. And now he's come out saying, whoa, this transgenderism is, denying biology. So it's interesting right now, you're seeing all kinds of allies, and of course, feminists too. The feminists are the ones who...
Old school feminists,
the
anyway.
Old yeah. The TERFs, right? The ones who are being slurred as TERFs.
Yeah. The world's in a weird place when evangelical Christians, old school feminists, and biologists are all in the same parade.
Yeah, I'm actually in a group. It's a private group we have a public presence on Facebook called Hands Across the Aisle.
Yeah.
But we also have a private group so we can talk to each other. And it's Christian women and very liberal, leftist, socialist, largely lesbian women, the old, like you say, the old school feminists. Yeah. And we're co-authoring op-ed pieces together. Wow. And sample legislation. And several of them have testified before Congress because they're so happy to get a radical leftist, out there explaining why she thinks transgenderism is not a good thing and how it's destroying women's rights. You cannot you cannot grant rights to a group that you cannot define. So if you cannot define women, you destroy women's rights.
Yeah, you made a claim in the book, Love Thy Body, that secular liberalism generally destroys human rights.
Yeah, go back to the abortion, because that's where it's
Sure.
the clearest, because there they say, bioethicists say, the fetus is human, but it's not a person. And so it has no moral status. It does not warrant legal protection. And so you're right. Being human is not enough for human rights. Or you asked about euthanasia earlier. It's just the same reasoning in reverse. In other words, if you lose a certain level of cognitive functioning and self-awareness, then you are no longer a person, even though you're clearly still human.
I'm just thinking here, wasn't the human versus person divide part of the pro-slavery sort of movement? Like, wasn't that the justification for keeping people in chains?
Yes, and I think, and it's not just slavery in the U.S. Many civilizations have chosen some group that they say, well, they're not fully human.
Yeah.
And then that justifies oppressing them, going to war against them, depriving them of rights. But yes, here in America, it was particularly with slavery. Yeah, that they were non-persons. And personhood is a legal category, a moral category.
Yeah.
So if you can be human but not a person, then you no longer have human rights. The whole idea of human rights is if you're a member of the human race, you have these rights. You don't need to earn additional capabilities. You don't have to achieve a certain level of mental abilities in order to qualify.
Yeah.
I was invited to speak on a podcast in San Francisco once, and I thought this could be a challenging audience.
Yeah.
And so ahead of time, the producer wanted to interview me, and he asked me for my views on abortion, and he said, well, most people think abortion is okay until the fetus becomes a person. And I said, there's a lot of philosophical baggage in that phrase. What you're saying is the pro-abortion side is exclusive because it says certain people can be human but not make the cut. They don't qualify for the rights of personhood. The pro-life view is inclusive. It says as long as you're a member of the human race, you're in, you count, you have the full rights of personhood. The pro-choice view is fragmented because it says you can kind of separate body from person and say that the body is irrelevant. It's insignificant. It has no meaning. It has no value. It has no dignity.
Yeah.
The pro-life view is holistic. It says, no, you can't separate the body from the person that way. The body is intrinsic, inherent part of who you are as a person and shares in the dignity of your personhood. By the way, after hanging up, a few days later, they called me and said, we've decided to cancel that show.
We've had a scheduling conflict. Sorry, we'll call you
So that's why you never hear our position in public.
Yeah.
We get and this was before cancel culture, but now, we got canceled.
What is it about Christian theology as it's lived out in the West now that causes us to miss this? Like, I look around churches, and I've been around Christianity my whole life, and I don't see people treating their bodies much different than I do in the world. And it would seem like if we really believed what you're saying here, that the body is intrinsically part of us, intrinsically worthy and sacred because God designed it and is not to be discarded or thrown away, then we would treat our bodies differently now. I see a lot of gluttony, a lot of sexual issues, a lot of unhealth, I guess, in the church, just as much as I do in the world. What do you think we're missing in what we're teaching in the church?
Well, let me start out with the early church, where we still had the biblical view. The early church was born into a Greek and Roman culture that devalued the body, just like modern secularism does, though for very different reasons. The early church faced isms like Gnosticism. A lot of the New Testament was written against Gnosticism, Platonism, Manichaeism. Augustine was a Manichae, right? So all of these isms treated the material world as the realm of death, decay, and destruction.
Yeah.
Plato called the body the prison of the soul. And salvation was defined as getting liberated from that prison, leaving the material world behind. And so salvation was defined as, reascending to the higher realms. And in this context, and this was partly because of their view of creation. Because this world was evil, it must be the product of an evil God. So Gnosticism taught that there were several levels of spiritual entities, and that this world was created by a low-level deity, who was actually an evil God. So Christianity was revolutionary in this context because it said, no, this world was created by not some low-level deity, but by the supreme deity, who is good. And therefore, this universe is intrinsically good. And the fall does not negate that. The fall is like taking a beautiful masterpiece and a child scribbles on it. It defaces it, but the original beauty still shines through.
Right.
But the greatest scandal in the early church was the teaching of the incarnation, because what it said was that that same supreme deity had actually entered into the physical world and taken on a physical body.
Yeah.
That was the greatest scandal. And when he died on the cross, when he was executed, we might say he did escape the prison of the body, as Gnosticism taught we should aspire to do.
Sure.
But what did he do then? He came back.
Right.
In a physical body.
Yeah.
To the ancient Greeks, this was not spiritual progress. And literally they argued, why would anyone want to come back to the realm of the body? That's why Paul says the idea of a bodily resurrection was foolishness to the Greeks, 1 Corinthians.
And scandalous to the Jews.
Yes.
Yeah. Fascinating.
And then at the end of time, what is God going to do? He's not going to scrap the material universe as if you made a mistake the first time around.
Yeah.
Like, oops, let's do something different. He's going to restore it and renew it and create a new heavens and a new earth.
Right.
And you and I will be there in physical bodies.
Sure.
From the very beginning, the Apostles' Creed affirmed the resurrection of the body. So this is an amazingly, astonishingly high view of the physical realm. There's nothing like it in
really
any other religion or philosophy.
But we don't talk about it enough. And it's really, it's like you say, it's unique to the philosophical sort of conversation going on. And yet we just don't champion it enough. And I'm just not sure I'm not sure the average Christian gets it, Nancy. In the pews today, I think people still think our bodies go to the ground and our souls go to heaven.
Right. That last part, what's God going to do at the end of time? I've attended a Lutheran church for a while, and every Sunday it was, aren't we glad we're saved so we can go to heaven? Let's thank God that we're saved so we can go to heaven. Everything was so we can go to heaven. And
Sure.
I thought, does this pastor think we have that gospel has anything to say to this life? So that's what I grew up with. But where did it come from? It came from the fact that, I just mentioned that the early church was born into a Greek and Roman culture. And when they looked around for a philosophical vocabulary, they had a theological vocabulary, the early church fathers.
Yeah.
But of course, you have to also translate it into a philosophical vocabulary. So they looked around and they said, well, there's some materialists here like Democritus and Epicurus. We know we don't like those.
Yeah.
But Plato and Aristotle, they're not materialists. They believe in some sort of a transcendent realm. And so what they did is they absorbed a lot of Greek thought. And that's where we get our sacred secular split from. It's not from Scripture. It's because we absorbed that Greek thought. All through the Middle Ages, Neoplatonism was considered a Christian philosophy. If you look it up now, and Wikipedia or Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they'll sometimes call Neoplatonism a Christian philosophy.
Sure. There's
and
overlap,
it's not.
right? But it's not the same. But what do we do then with the flesh is weak and the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak? Or what do we do with those dichotomies that do pop up in the New Testament, especially?
Yeah, the trouble is, of course, that every language has different meanings for the same word, right? So God so loved the world. Okay, God loved the world. But 1 John says you should not love the world.
Right.
Obviously, the word world is used in different places, different senses. And the same thing with flesh. Sometimes it does mean our sinful nature, and sometimes it just means the body. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we sometimes get confused. We have to look at the context and figure out, from the Greek, which meaning of flesh is being used in this particular passage. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of our confusion has come from.
Yeah, it just comes back to what I say often, which is I wish the church at large had a better PR firm, because this is a beautiful message that you're sending. And I hope more and more people, and Christians in particular, will get wind of this and articulate it and live it out. Because if you ask the average person today, who's more body positive, Christians or non-Christians, I'm thinking most secular folks will say non-Christians.
And Christian. The one mildly negative review that came out of Love Thy Body, it was mostly positive, but it's by a Christian philosopher. And he said, but Nancy's wrong on when she says that Christianity has a higher view of the body than the secular person. He thought I was wrong. My response to that is, yes, you would think that if you're a secular person and you think the physical world is all it is, you would think you would have a very high view of the physical world, right? You think it's really important.
Yeah.
But if you think it's a product of blind, purposeless forces with no inherent meaning, a bunch of chemicals came together to create life by accident, that's not a high view of the physical world. You may think it's all that exists, but that doesn't mean you have a high view of its value, its significance, its dignity. It's a low view of the physical world.
Right. Yeah, I think the reputation comes from the Christian call to self-denial. And you're lifting up the Christian call to self-love, which is beautiful. Like, love your body is something, seems like the whole world is dying to do. But self-denial is countercultural, I think. And I think the miscommunication might be that when Christians say, hey, just because you think you want something doesn't mean you should do that thing. It's not an act of self-hate. It's really the best way to love God and love yourself sometimes is by showing restraint and self-control, which is a gift of the Holy Spirit,
Well, self-denial means denying sin. It doesn't mean denying the way God made you. I had a student once who was brilliant computer science student. And so as he was graduating, I said, well, what are you going to do next? I'm going to be a lawyer. I said, what? Why aren't you going into computer science? You're obviously very gifted. He said, well, my Christian professors told me I had to do something that was more meaningful, and that as a lawyer I could defend religious liberty cases. And I was supposed to deny myself and do something that was more important. I said, deny yourself means denying your sin. It doesn't mean denying the gifts God has given you.
Yeah.
And you don't think you can have a great impact on the world through computer science? Look at the impact that technology has on our lives. Of course you can. Well, I ran into him some years later, and he's in computer science. But that mistaken notion that deny yourself does not mean your nature, your gifts, your talents that God has given you. It means deny your sin. And I find that's a common misunderstanding, too.
Probably. I would, maybe as a little bit of pushback here, I would say I would bet that this message is that the church is inherently body positive is harder for women to accept than men because of some of the messages that are communicated to women who grow up in or around the church. I think there's sometimes a lot of shaming sort of thrown women's way about their bodies in ways that I never experienced as a boy growing up. If I wore short shorts to church, nobody said anything about it. Not that I ever would or did, but if I ever did, I might get people joking about it, but nobody would shame me for it. But I know a lot of women who have felt like, if they weren't sufficiently modest in their dress or their appearance or whatever, they could be shamed for their body. And it's a hard message for them maybe to accept that Christianity is inherently body positive.
Yes, although I think it's not just in the church. There was a psychological study done once when people were supposed to say, it was the task was sketch out, the sort of the stereotypical male and then the stereotypical woman. And, just sketch it out. The men always had faces. In fact, often it was just a face.
Huh.
The women always had bodies, sometimes no head at all.
Jeez.
No face at all.
Yeah.
Or a blank face. So we think of men in terms of their character. When you look at someone in the eyes and you have a conversation, you're looking into their face. So you judge men more by their character and by their personality and who they are. Women, outside the church as well, are judged by their bodies.
Yeah.
I thought that was a fascinating study.
Yeah,
and women as well as men would draw the women, all the...
Is that right?
All the physical details, the shape. Yes, women as well as men would do that.
Interesting. Well, I mean, and we see that in the world, that playing out in the world, that sort of, if we are just sort of meat packets and we can judge each other like you would judge a piece of, meat at the livestock show or whatever, then maybe that's why we have OnlyFans now. Maybe that's why we have a problem to say the least, with pornographic material and the abuse and use of it online. Maybe that's why we have so many of the obesity-related problems that we have. Is if this is just meat and not really sacred at all, then it's just for show and for pleasure.
Yeah, it's funny when I speak at conferences and so on. I always get people coming up to me and saying that they're using Love Thy Body for other things besides the topics I covered. The first one was a woman, actually she was one of my students, a grad student whose teenage daughter had a severe eating disorder, so severe that she had to be hospitalized. And she said, when her daughter came home, we are going through your book, Love Thy Body,
wow,
sentence by sentence. She said, I didn't know that I should teach her to love her body. That she was destroying her body because she hated it.
Yeah.
And I've had people come up to me after speaking saying things like, I'm using your book because I was sexually abused, and I learned to try to detach myself from my body because my body was the source of pain. I've talked to people who've had drug addiction and obesity. So it is interesting that Love Thy Body is much broader than even the topics that I covered in the book. But you mentioned pornography, and the hookup culture is a chapter in the book. And I do talk there about how that too represents that sort of split between the body and the person. I quote a young college student named Naomi who said, the mistake, it was in Rolling Stone magazine, the mistake people make is they assume that there are two distinct elements in a relationship, one emotional and one physical, and they pretend that there are clean lines between them. So she was seeing that the only way you could really be involved in the hookup culture was to kind of separate yourself from your body. Or another quote from a college student named Alicia who said, the hookup culture is very scripted. You learn to turn everything off except your body. You make yourself emotionally invulnerable. So people involved in the hookup culture recognize the only way I can do this is to try to separate myself from my body.
Gosh.
Otherwise,
it just wouldn't be survivable.
Yes, in fact, there's a book out that came out after mine, so it's not in there, but it was a book on prostitution. And it was the first book where she actually went and interviewed prostitutes. And it was amazing. One after another, they all said, the only way I can do this is to completely separate myself, from what my body's doing. That's how I survive, is I make that distinction. I thought, there it is again. The only way they can survive in this job, this line of work, is to say, you're not touching myself. You're touching my body, but you are not touching myself.
Right. That's it reminds me of I don't remember the quote, but there's a quote like that from the movie Pretty Woman from the early 90s, I think, where she's just like, I just turn everything off and I get in there and I do it and I get out. And then to the guy she says that to, Richard Gere, she says, except with you, and to make him feel, cared for or whatever. But yeah, I think that is the only way to survive a world in which we're called upon to give ourselves away.
there was a psychologist who I quote in the book who works on a college campus, and she said the two most prescribed medications on the college campus are birth control pills and antidepressants. And she said that's not a coincidence.
Yeah, there might be a correlation there, actually, and a causation. But the question, I think, on many people's minds is, how is it better to tell young Christians and old Christians that sexually, let's say, just not even putting everything else aside, food and all the other stuff we've talked about, just with people's sexual expressions and sex lives, to wait and save everything for marriage, and even if it takes longer than you hope, to wait and hold on to your sexuality, keep that, saved for marriage. How is that more liberating and more loving of the body?
Because it keeps the whole person integrated. In other words, I often get from my students, isn't it enough to be in love? But even then, that's not, if sex, think of it this way, the deepest, most intimate, most complete physical union is meant to express the most complete and intimate emotional and personal union. I mean, it's meant to be expression of the inner person.
Yeah.
And so if your inner person is not completely committed with this person, then in a sense you're lying with your body. You're saying something that's not true.
Yeah.
Because if what you do is an expression of your inner self, and it is. I mean, how do we know the other person's inner self? By what they do with their body, what they say, what they do. So in one sense, your body is even more important because it's the only way I know your inner self.
Yeah.
And so if what you do is expressing your inner self, then the most complete and intimate physical union is meant to be an expression of the most complete personal union. And anything less than that is not telling the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to tell you, this was how I thought of it when I was a teenager, even when I was not a Christian.
Really?
Yeah. I thought, I'm lying. If I let a guy even hold my hand, if I even let him hold my hand when I don't like him,
Right.
in a sense, I'm lying with my body. I'm saying something that's not true.
Yeah.
And so, if it's as true of something as simple as letting somebody hold your hand, how much more is it true of the sexual union?
Yeah. What's interesting about hookup culture is it's gotten to the point now where holding a hand is a bigger deal than hooking up.
That's true.
And, I've heard young people talk about how they've hooked up with more people than they've held hands with. And that seems to be a common phenomenon these days. It's very sad
Yes.
sign of the times.
Yes, it is.
I think it's always shocking to people when they see the data, though, on sexual satisfaction. And the most sexually satisfied people seem to be folks that are monogamous and married and having more sex than anyone and better sex, apparently, by their own accord.
And do you know, I do talk about this in the next book, the data that you just mentioned. It first came to light in 1977 in the magazine Red Book. I don't know if you even remember.
I have vague memories in the checkout aisle. Yeah.
Red Book was a women's, completely secular women's magazine. And they did a survey and they asked some questions about sexuality and they asked questions about religion. And to their great surprise, they discovered that highly religious women who are married have much higher levels of sexual satisfaction.
Yeah.
1977.
Right.
And it's been repeatedly replicated. So
clearly that's a shock to people because they expect Christians to be prudish and boring and, just utilitarian about sex. And so it takes the world by surprise when they hear these things.
Exactly. If you want to keep up with it, the Institute for Family Studies is constantly churning out these studies and constantly finding out that married people, and especially married Christians, have the highest level of satisfaction.
Fantastic. I'm happy to hear that as a married Christian myself. Let's talk about this second book because it's so good, and we're not doing it justice today. But this is the second book on toxic masculinity. It's called "The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes." I hope we can have you back in the future on to get deeper into this. But just tell us why you chose this topic and why you wrote this book.
A couple reasons, but my eye certainly was caught by the level of hostility that it's become acceptable to express against men and masculinity. The Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, really? A mainstream publication like that?
Why can't we hate men?
Why can't we hate men?
Wow.
You have done us wrong, is the second part.
Sorry.
And the Huffington Post editor tweeted hashtag kill all men.
What?
And you can buy T-shirts that say so many men, so little ammunition.
Wow.
Books have come out with titles like I Hate Men, No Good Men, and Are Men Necessary?
Oof. I think we are still. Barely.
Yeah, well,
Biologically. For now.
you keep qualifying that.
Yeah.
And even men are jumping on the bandwagon. There's a male author who wrote a book in which he said talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer.
Wow.
And this one came out just a few weeks ago, so it's not even in the book. But did you see this? The director of the movie Avatar,
James Cameron?
yes, James Cameron, said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system.
Ooh.
So no wonder a survey finds that 46% of American men, almost half of American men, agreed with the statement, these days, society seems to punish men just for acting like men.
Ah, wow.
So whether you agree or not, that is a large percentage of people who do think men are getting a bad deal. And in fact, there was one in Britain even more recently that was 55% of men. So it's going up.
When they say acting like men, what do you think they mean? Or what's the survey's intent there?
Yeah, I found that this is Toxic War and Masculinity has proven to be the most controversial book I've written. And
That's saying a lot, Nancy.
yeah,
You're not afraid of controversy.
yeah. When the earlier one had homosexuality, transgenderism, abortion, I really thought that would be. I did think that would be more controversial, and to my surprise, so I did a lot of reading groups and classes on masculinity, which I always do with all my books, to try to get the rough edges. And when they would talk to their family and friends, invariably the first question would be, "Whose side is she on?" With that tone, whose side is she on? The assumption is most of the men assumed I must be a male-bashing feminist,
Right, because you're a woman.
and then others thought maybe I'm some angry reactionary defending men.
Ah,
So
because you're a Christian?
yeah,
Okay.
yes,
Got it.
exactly, and so yes, so I'd be denying the toxic things men do.
Yeah.
And so I put this survey right at the front of the book. There is a very interesting survey done by a sociologist that kind of disarms that objection. So he's not a Christian. He's very well known in his field, and so he speaks all around the world. And so he came up with this interesting experiment. He would ask young men 2 questions. He'd say, "What does it mean to be a good man?" If you're at a funeral in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? He said, all around the world, young men have no problem answering that. They say things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, be responsible, be a provider, be a protector, look out for the little guy. I like that one. And he's done these surveys from Brazil to Sweden to Australia. And he said, men seem to have an innate knowledge. As we would say, they're made in God's image. They have an innate knowledge of what it means to be a good man. It's inherent. Romans 2, they all have a conscience.
Yeah.
But then he follows up with a second question. He says, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? Oh no, the young men would say, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, always win at all costs, is how they put it. Be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, the real man is what many people would consider more toxic traits. Certainly if it gets decoupled from the good man, from the moral ideal, it can easily slide into traits like entitlement, dominance, and control.
Yeah.
And so what it means is that men around the world, made in God's image, do have an innate sense of what it means to be a good man. But they also feel the cultural pressure to be the real man.
To man up.
To man up. And it does suggest a different approach that we can take. Instead of accusing men of being toxic, most men don't respond very well to being called toxic.
Yeah, imagine that.
But what we can do then is try to tap into their innate knowledge of what it means to be the good man. Can we affirm? Can we support? Can we ally with the good part of the man and draw that out? I think it gives us a much more positive way of approaching these issues.
How do you think we as Christians in particular can do that, whether it's through someone in the Bible that we look up to or some model of masculinity? How do we cast this vision?
Well, that gets into this is the most fact-based book I've written because it has sociological data on Christian men. And then it has a lot of historical data on how the secular concept of toxic masculinity, where did that come from?
Yeah.
You can't understand a social trend unless you see where it came from and how it developed. So it's kind of sociology and history. So this was the second reason I wanted to write the book. I ran across sociological data on Christian men that blew me away. It was astonishing. Obviously, Christian men are often considered exhibit A of toxic masculinity, right? They're considered the worst.
Because they're sort of controlling.
If you believe in any sort of concept of male headship,
right.
then obviously you're going to be controlling, overbearing, domineering patriarch.
So evangelical Christians or classical Catholic Christians or someone like that would be the worst in their...
Yeah, I'll give you one quote. It was easy to find quotes. I'll just give you one of them. The founder of the Church Too movement, which came after the Me Too movement, said that the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today.
Gosh.
So the social scientists looked at these charges and said, where's your evidence? You're making these accusations, where's your evidence?
Yeah.
So they went and did the studies and found out that evangelical Christian men are actually tested out as the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. There's, I quote more than a dozen different studies.
Oh, so there's multiple studies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm just thinking for our listeners, if they wanted to sort of verify this, I can imagine some people would want to look these up.
Exactly.
Yeah. So they'll have to buy your book to do that,
They have to buy it. They have to look at the endnotes. Well, here's the deal. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find these.
Yeah.
They're not being publicized.
Why? You don't have to tell me why. I know why. They don't fit the narrative.
But I did. I mean, I'm at a university, so I could go digging into the academic journals.
Yeah.
And what I found is, here's what and here's another pushback. I often hear people say, oh, well, of course the wives said they were happy. Their husband's sitting right there.
Right, they have to, yeah.
No, the wives were interviewed separately. These are large. Most of the studies were done using these large databases with thousands of people. Christian, non-Christian, Muslim, Jew, all kinds of people.
Wow.
So most of them were not done by small Christian groups.
What were the metrics used or the questions asked in some of these studies?
Well, I'll just tell you how they tested out. So the evangelical fathers test out, their wives test out as being as reporting being the happiest with their husband's love and affection.
Happier than any other?
Than any other group in
Wow.
America. The evangelical fathers test out as the most engaged with their children, both in shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in discipline, like setting limits on screen time and enforcing bedtime.
Sure.
Evangelical couples test out as having the lowest rate of divorce of any group in America.
Whoa, let's pause. Because people are saying right now, everyone's heard Christians and non-Christians get divorced at the same rate.
Okay, let me give you the last stat, and then we'll go to that. The last stat was they also have the lowest level of domestic violence of any major group in America.
Wow.
So it completely shatters the media stereotypes, the media narrative. Now, the first pushback I get is what you just said. Haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate? And in my research, I found that it's one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders.
By Christian leaders,
By Christian leaders.
Yep.
So they went back to the data. And the largest study was done by Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And he has a whole book. His study was so large, it fills a whole book. And he said they separated out Christian men, evangelicals, who actually live it out, who actually go to church regularly and are very committed,
Oh, yeah.
from nominal Christians.
Yep.
My students don't know what the word nominal is, so I have to explain. It means in name only.
That's right. They don't know, if you've ever done a survey and you don't know what other box to check, you're more Christian than anything else, you'll check the Christian box.
Baptist, yeah,
Sure.
yeah. They'll check that. But in America in particular, because we do have a lot of cultural Christianity compared to other countries.
There's rarely a box for lapsed Christian on those surveys.
Yeah, or cultural Christian.
Right, I wish there was.
Yeah, my family background,
Yeah, it would clarify some of our data, I think.
And nominal Christians tested out shockingly differently. I mean, they fit the toxic stereotypes.
How so?
So their wives report the lowest level of happiness with their husband's expressions of love.
Lowest meaning lower than other Christians, or lowest?
Lowest.
Really? Lower than secular people?
My memory is it's lower than secular people.
Wow.
They are the least engaged with their children, but this one I know for sure is lower than secular. They have the highest rates of divorce, higher than secular men. And they have the highest rates of domestic abuse and violence, higher than secular men.
Goodness gracious. What do you attribute that to? If you were...
Yeah, so people ask me that a lot, and of course the researchers don't exactly know. They just number crunch.
Yeah.
But apparently, it's because they're taking the secular views, they're taking religious language like headship and submission, but they're infusing it with secular meaning. The meanings of dominance and entitlement and control.
Yeah.
They're infusing it with secular meaning, but they're putting religious language on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they feel justified. Their religion is justifying them and giving them permission to be like this. Well, the secular person doesn't have religious justification.
Right.
So the Christian who has religious justification, but who's living out the secular script, is actually ending up then being worse.
Yeah. Because not only do I feel like doing the wrong thing, God is letting me or blessing me in doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
It's added justification.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's why the numbers are so skewed. Because if you just do a study of evangelicals, you're getting men who are better than secular men, and you're getting men that are worse than secular men. So of course the numbers are going to be misleading. They're going to be skewed.
Well, I can't express this properly, but I know day to day in ministry, there's nothing more exhilarating than watching a man become a man in the best and biblical sense of the word, a man who really gets biblical manhood, not just because you see the lights come on in him, which is a beautiful thing to behold, but you see the ripple effects of one man choosing to become a man like Jesus affects so many others in ways that I don't want to demean or diminish sort of other situations. When a child comes to Jesus or when a woman comes to Jesus, all of those situations have different effects on others. But when a man authentically comes to Jesus and lives into his biblical masculinity, there is something profound and I would dare say generational in the shift.
It is generational. So there was an award-winning study, 35 years. So a longitudinal study done by, his last name is Bengtson. And he found, I'm going to have to memorize the numbers because I don't remember the numbers. He found that if a father is a Christian, his children are more likely to follow him in the faith than if the mother's a Christian. I'll have to go back and check the numbers on this one because it was something like 65% versus 40-some%.
Wow, significant.
Yes, very significant. That if the father is the spiritual leader in the home, the children follow him.
Right. But I would guess that if the father was nominal in his Christianity, that the effect on his kids' generation would be a net negative for the kingdom of God.
Yes, well, here's what Bengtson says. It has to do with the warmth and closeness of the relationship that the children have with the father. If he's got all the correct doctrine, if he's a pillar of the church, if he's an upstanding, respectable person,
right,
but he's not warm to his kids, they don't follow him.
Fascinating.
It has to do with the warm relationship. And there's another study, by the way, that even found the masculinity depends on the relationship. Here's what, it's a science reporter, wrote a book, and he said it doesn't hinge on the masculinity of the father. The masculinity of the son doesn't hinge on the father's masculinity. It hinges on his warm, close relationship with the son. The son will be, have a positive sense of his own masculinity.
Yeah.
if the father has a warm relationship. So, and that's a secular study. So both the Christian study and the secular study are saying it all depends on the father's close, loving relationship with the son.
Wow. So there's so much here that I want to talk about, but this book, again, Toxic War on Masculinity, is available on Amazon and anywhere you want to buy books. Have you had time in the last 2 weeks to stop and consider the deep and rich irony of a woman like yourself having been raised by an abusive father, writing a book, a deeply researched book in defense of masculinity and lifting up masculinity as something good and godly?
So I was interviewed by a Christian psychologist.
Yeah.
And he said...
Was this an interview or a session?
Yeah, podcast. Podcast.
Yeah.
And he said, I opened your book and I read your story and I thought, oh no, it's going to be, as an abused woman, she's going to be angry at men. Mm-hmm. And then he said, as I got into it, I thought, no, it's very affirming of men. It's very supportive. It's very warm. And he said, it turns out what happened is your experience just gives you that authenticity of having been there. You know, you're not writing from an ivory tower.
Yeah.
You had to personally work through a very negative view of masculinity. Of course, I went through my feminist stage.
Right.
A long one. Mm-hmm. A long feminist stage, where, of course, men were evil. All the world's problems are because of men. So, I went through that reactionary phase. But I appreciate him saying that when you've been there, I've experienced the worst, some of the worst of masculinity and worked through, like I said earlier, I started at L'Abri, started working through the emotional and psychological healing, and it's very long-term. It's very deep. It takes many years. I've read every book out there on Christianity and psychology or emotional healing. I've read them all. But that's how I'll just put it that way. He said, it's clear you're not writing from an ivory tower, but from the trenches.
Yeah, you have a really unique perspective, a unique story that adds a lot of credence to your work. And I hope anyone listening or watching right now is absorbing that and seeing that, and will go pick up your books, because you speak, unlike a lot of academics, I will say, you speak to people who are sincerely on the margins of Christianity, and some of them are sort of Christians just barely on the inside, and some of them are non-Christians barely on the outside, and you speak again with such authenticity to those folks who have questions that I think I know lives are changed by your work. When you put a book out like The Toxic War on Masculinity, you're taking a lot of risks. You've mentioned how controversial it was, and just as a final question, I guess I would ask, what is your hope, your ultimate hope in putting out a work like this one for people to read and consume?
Well, I have 2 sons. So that's part of the personal goal, too, is I don't want them growing up in a world that's hostile to masculinity. There is, I have a quote in there from a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, in my practice, I'm getting young men increasingly who are coming in defeated, feeling demeaned, feeling demoralized, because they sense that they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. And although, of course, this is for women too, which is why the subtitle is How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes.
Yeah.
Because obviously women have a big stake as well.
For sure.
In men getting a biblical, God-centered view of masculinity.
Great. Well, thank you again for all you're doing to get the truth out there, for telling your story and being vulnerable. Again, if you're watching or listening to this right now, I hope you'll go pick up both of these books, The Toxic War on Masculinity and also Love Thy Body, both of them by Professor Nancy Pearcey. Nancy, thank you so much for being with us today on Maybe God.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Hope to have you back.